So I'd like to welcome everybody who's joining us online. I recognize that people are joining us at different parts of this conference, so if you're just joining us now, my name is Doug Larkin. I'm a professor here at Montclair State University and one of the principal investigators on our IMPRESS study, where we looked at the retention of science teachers over a 5-year period nationally. We have gathered here at the conference center here at Montclair on a beautiful, clear day. The smoke is gone. It's really nice. We have gathered today educators, doctoral students, and a wide variety of educational stakeholders from across the country to talk about teacher retention. I'm very pleased to announce our next speaker, and I'm going to read the introduction here. Tuan Nguyen is an associate professor in the Department of Curriculum and Instruction at Kansas State University. He applies rigorous quantitative methods, quasi-experimental designs, and meta-analysis to examine the teacher labor markets, particularly looking at the factors that drive teacher attrition and retention, and the effects and implications of teacher policies and education policies intended for social equity and school improvement. He has also examined issues of rurality and rural educations in various contexts. We will be having a question and answer at the end of his talk, both for the online attendees and the in-person attendees. If you have questions during the talk, please feel free to enter them into the Q&A section on the webinar, and I'll be moderating both the in-room and online questions at the end of the talk. So it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Tuan Nguyen.
Thank you, Doug. Hello, everybody. I'm Tuan. It is my pleasure to be here. It's an absolute honor to have been here, participate with everybody here in person since yesterday. So I'm really going to try to honor the discussions we've had, and I hope that the presentations will resonate with you in many different ways that we've talked about, and also potentially bring in some new information and put some of the things that you talked about and we've talked about into a larger context. All right, so a little bit of outline of what we're going to talk about today. So a little bit about me, my background, my experience. Then we'll talk about teacher shortages around the country, and then the connections between the teacher supply, the teacher retention, and the teacher shortage. And then we'll talk about policy recommendations and strategies for retention and recruitment. So a little bit about me. I taught middle school and high school math for 7 years before I went back to do my graduate school at Vanderbilt University. I'm currently an associate professor at Kansas State University. My research interests and expertise really lie in 3 main buckets, and most of them are really about teachers, because I was a teacher for so long. That's sort of the first hat that I put on when I think about policies and research. So my main bucket is in the teacher labor market. So thinking about the teacher supply, retention, and shortages. So all the things that we talk about today are very much my go-to. And I also think about teacher education policies, so larger policies that that affect teachers in some ways, like NCLB, Race to the Top. So sort of very much federal or state or district policies that could potentially influence how teachers work. And I also work some with rurality and rural educations. In many ways, that third bucket there came about because I started working at Kansas State University, and I didn't have a set of connections to the place when I first started, and I wanted to be a part of the community. And I felt like, hey, I should belong to the community, and I should understand the community. So that's in part why I developed my work and interest in rural education there. All right, so to start off with, this is something most of us know very well, but teachers are critical to student learning, right? The teachers are the most important factors in terms of what students learn. However, in the last few years, particularly after COVID, we have had a lot of news reports that there are critical shortages in many districts in many states. So in response, states have lower requirements for certified teachers. They have used retired teachers, administrators, and parents, and even the National Guard to fill classrooms because they didn't have enough teachers in certain districts in certain states. At the same time, we have seen a decline in the teacher production or the number of people who are interested in being teachers, and the teacher turnover, so the number of teachers who are retiring or who are leaving the professions have increased since COVID, okay? So we have that sort of general background picture of the teacher supply. Now, some, though, argue that there is a national teacher shortage, but others contend that there's really an imbalanced distribution of teachers. What does that mean? Meaning that we are producing enough teachers, but they tend to be located in certain subjects, and they tend to be located in certain states, and we're not distributing that equitably across states or districts, okay? So it really depends on where you are and your experience with school, what state you are in, that you experience the teacher shortage may be very different than another person in a nearby state. So when we looked into this, it was really surprising to myself and a number of my colleagues that the federal government doesn't really collect information on the extent to which there is a shortage. So states are required to report that there is a shortage in certain subject areas, but they don't report on the magnitude of that shortage. So you could be short, so North Carolina could be short one special ed teacher, and that has the same information that they turn in to the federal government compared to if they have 100 teacher shortage, right? They also don't differentiate what is meant by shortage. So a shortage could mean one of two things. One, it could be a vacancy, right? So you have a posting and you can't find anybody to find that posting. Even if you have lower requirements and you're looking into subs, you can't find that job, fill that posting, okay? And another way of people thinking about shortage is under qualifications, right? So that you're not certified to teach in that particular district, or that you don't have the right certification. So for instance, you are an English teacher who's teaching mathematics, for instance, right? So it was very, very surprising to me that the federal government doesn't collect this information. So my advisee, a doctoral student, and I set out to find this information. So we combed over thousands and thousands of online reports and news reports, and we went to every single State Department and as well as Board of Education websites and journal articles to find to what extent do we know there is a teacher shortage in every single state, right? So when we think about a national teacher shortage, that would sort of inform us of this big picture. So it took us about a year and a half to try to collect all this information for every state plus DC. And then the hard work began when we tried to really verify that the information that's presented in newspapers or articles are actually accurate. I'm not sure if you know this or not, but a lot of times the numbers that are reported in newspapers aren't always reflective of what's actually going on behind the scene. They may use the wrong number, they may misrepresent the number. A lot of times they don't provide a source of where they got that number. So you see a headline of like, we're short 1,400 teachers. Where did that number come from? Did that come from the state board? Did that come from a researcher? Sometimes we don't know. So it was really difficult to try to kind of suss that out, right? So I already talked about this, about the vacancy and the qualifications. So we took a year and a half to put all that information together, and we actually built a website called www.teachershortages.com. So if you have a phone right now, or if you have a laptop, feel free to go to this website right now, www.teachershortages.com. It's very easy to remember, I hope, right? So this is just pulling all the information together. And the one thing I cannot do with the PowerPoint that you can do on your phone or on your laptop is you can hover over each state and see whether or not we have information about that particular state. And if you click on it, it will send it to one of the links of where did we find this information, right? So this is one of the first maps that we created. This shows the raw counts of reported teacher vacancy by state for all the United States as of 21-22 school year. So you can see here in New Jersey that if you hover over it, you will see something like, can anybody hover over New Jersey for me and see? 148, right? That's the reported number of the vacant positions that you had in New Jersey as of 21-22 school year, okay? And that would be in sort of this greenish bucket for us in between 1 and 999 vacant positions. There are some states where they have more than 1,000 vacant positions. In fact, many states have more than 1,000 vacant teaching positions, all the way up to more than 3,000. As you can see in Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia, Florida, they have more than 3,000 vacations as of last year. Those numbers have changed this year. Numbers for Arizona, for instance, have increased since the 21-22 school year and the 22-23 school year. All right, so we have this first map that shows you the landscape of what teacher vacancy looks like in the United States. Now, some people may say, well, that's not a really apple-to-apple comparison because there aren't as many people or students in, say, Kansas relative to, say, California or New York. So in order to do a more apple-to-apple comparison, what we're looking here in this next map, and it's also on the website if you select the second map, this is the vacancies by 10,000 students, so by a per capita basis, right? So this is going to make it more apple to apple. You see in my home state in Kansas that what used to be, I think around 1,200 last year in this second quartile has now become the fourth quartile. So per capita, we actually have in Kansas one of the highest vacancy rate in the United States. Mississippi and Alabama are still very high. It is, I think, the highest, if I recall correctly, in Mississippi. The ratio of vacancy per capita in Mississippi is like 160 times as high as it is in Missouri or in Utah. Vacancy rates vary drastically across state context. Okay, right? In New Jersey here, you can see it's still this in the first quartile. Okay, and some of you who know this context are going, that doesn't seem right. There's something else going on. Okay, potentially. So we're going to go to the third map where we are looking at underqualification. So these are teachers who are teaching right now, but they may have emergency certification, or they may not be teaching out of subject. Okay. So now, when we look at this, New Jersey then becomes the fourth quartile. So what it looks like from the work we're pulling together is you don't have as many vacancies here in New Jersey compared to the rest of the United States, but you have fairly high underqualification rate. Okay, in Florida, it's around 9 or 10% underqualification. So 1 out of every 10 teachers in Florida is underqualified by Florida's own standards. This is not Tuan standards. I'm not saying what teachers got to be, what the qualifications have to be in the classroom. Okay, this is by their own standards. 10% of their workforce is underqualified. All right. So when we think about teacher shortages, what are the factors that contribute to this? Okay, so that's where I'm going to go next. So the current teacher shortage is really going to inform the future teacher shortage, right? That makes sense, right? We think about 21-22 school year, that's going to inform the 22-23, and it's going to inform the 23-24 school year, okay? There are 2 other pieces to this. One is the teacher supply, and the other is teacher retention, okay? Clearly, if you have more teachers coming into the profession, that should help alleviate some of the teacher shortages, or you retain teachers at a higher rate, right? Then that would also help. So those are the 3 pieces of information that we're working with here that are contributing to the next wave of teacher shortage. All right. So I'm going to present to you now some ongoing work that I have. So this is the teacher supply nationally in the United States from 2009 to 2019. Okay, the blue line is total enrollment of teacher candidates who are enrolled in teacher ed programs. Okay, the red line is the number of people who actually complete teacher prep programs and then can join the labor market. Okay, so in 2009, 2010, there were approximately 700,000 people who wanted to become teachers. So they joined teacher prep programs, alt-cert programs, right? As you can see, that has dropped drastically since 2009, 2010. By 2015, 2016, it has dropped to under 400,000, and that has gone up a little bit, and then it's gone down a little bit, but it's stabilizing around the 400,000 mark. So compared to what it was a decade ago, 11, 12 years ago, we have lost about 40% of the potential teacher supply. People who are interested in becoming teachers has dropped about 40% since 2009, 2010. Okay. Now, the red line, as I said, in some ways, that's the line that some people care more about. It's like not only the people who are joining teacher prep programs, right? You can join a prep program and you go, this is not the right thing for me. That's perfectly fine, right? We've talked about that before. But it's how many people are completing? Since 2010, that number has continued to drop. Even when we've seen an uptick in enrollment in teacher prep programs, we have seen a continual decline in the number of people who are completing their degrees in order to be certified. That's nothing to say about how many of these people are actually joining the labor market, right? It's not everybody who finished a teaching degree program is going to become a teacher, right? They may not have the right, find the right fit. They may not find a job right away, right? They may delay for whatever reason. That's disconcerting, right? So teacher supply, that's one part of this. That has continued to drop over time. So then you're going, well, maybe that's the national picture. Well, what does that look like for my state? Okay? I'm going to pause here and let you look at that for a little bit. Well, take a sip of water. As you're looking over this, you see that most states. I can hear you online. Okay, great. Because at home, when I'm teaching and my kids are there, they're like, you're too loud. I don't know why you keep yelling into your laptop. Your students can't possibly like that. But here I am. All right. As you can see, for most states here, what do we see? We see a decline, right, in teacher enrollment and teacher productions over time. Okay. There are only a few states where it has remained fairly stable or has increased. Okay. So for instance, Texas has actually increased the teacher production over time, and you're going, why is that? Why is that, right? So this is ongoing work, but we're looking into that, and one of the reasons is the alt-cert programs in Texas is a wild landscape in Texas, all right? And as an additional piece of this, and we think this is going to become a fairly worthy headline, is the number of for-profit programs that are running in Texas and the number of teachers that are being produced by these for-profit programs. And I'm not sure if you're familiar with for-profit programs, but many of them do very, very little to actually train people to become teachers. So that's disconcerting. But by and large, what we see across the vast majority of states, teacher production has dropped over time, significantly so. Okay? All right, and then now you're thinking, well, what about STEM teachers specifically? Maybe that's a different story. It is not. In some ways, it's a worse. The production of, as you can see, top of around 30,000 of STEM teachers being produced nationally in 2010. That has decreased to just above 20,000 STEM teachers as of 2019. It's about a 33% reduction in the number of STEM teachers that are being produced. Okay, so what we're seeing here is that nationally, and specifically for STEM teachers, there is a constant decline in the number of people who are interested in becoming teachers in the first place, and of those who are finishing teacher degree programs. Okay, and we have very little evidence as to how many of those actually then join the profession. Okay, but I can't imagine that it's getting any better based on what we can see sort of nationally. All right. So then at this point, you're going, okay, so you have three pieces to the puzzle, right? The current teacher shortage, which we know is pretty bad, right? And then teacher supply, that doesn't look great. Okay, what about teacher attrition and retention? Okay, so prior to the pandemic, approximately 8% of teachers leave the profession every year. So out of every 100 teachers, 8% of them are going to just not become teachers anymore, right? Going to leave the profession and join another career. Another 7 to 8% switch schools from one school to another, okay? Since the pandemic, this has increased substantially in many states. In Alaska, the turnover rate, instead of 8%, is 22%. In Arkansas, it's almost 12%. Illinois, 12%. Louisiana, almost 14%. North Carolina, almost 16%. South Carolina, 15%. Right? In almost every state where we can find teacher attrition and retention information, we have seen that it has increased by 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8% relative to what it was prior to the pandemic. So many researchers and policymakers are investing so much time in trying to figure out, like, what does retention look like in my state? Okay, and unfortunately, we don't have this information for every single state either. Some states don't have very robust longitudinal data systems that allows them to track to see how many teachers they're losing every year. That's a problem because it's hard to think about how to address the teacher retention issue if you don't know how many of your teachers are leaving. So myself and many of my colleagues are working on this currently to try to figure out, like, how many people are leaving the professions every single year. And we're going to try to pull all of this pictures into a cohesive, a comprehensive whole. So that website that you saw before, teachershortages.com, in the next iteration of that, I'm hoping to update that by August or September. What I'm going to do is then show, in addition to the number of vacant positions for the latest data that we have for your particular state. So like for some it will be 22, 23, for some it may even be the 23, 24 school year, depending on when we get it on the website. So in addition to that vacancy information, we're going to have information about teacher production, teacher supply. If there's information about teacher retention and attrition in your state, we'll put that on there. The number of students you have, the number of teachers you have. So you just hover every state and you can kind of see then what's happening in my state, sort of like a trend, and you can see that, okay? But the big picture nationally is that teacher supply is decreasing over time, substantially over time, about 40% since 2009, 2010. And teacher retention has declined, teacher attrition has gone up. So you can imagine that future teacher shortages are just going to worsen, okay? We need to think about what's happening in not just our schools, but in our society that's driving a lot of this, okay? And that's a whole other discussions that we can get into, okay? But I'll just kind of leave that to your imaginations at this point to think about what else is potentially going on here. Now, in terms of making like broad recommendations that what states can do at this point to address some of the problems that we're seeing now, we have to think about making targeted policy decisions to meet the current demands, okay? And from other research, we know that teacher vacancy and teacher underqualification tend to be worse at economically disadvantaged schools, majority minority schools. So we have to think about making policy decisions targeted at those schools to help them specifically, all right? And then we have to think about the subject area. We know for years now, decades, that STEM teachers, right? There's a decline in STEM teachers, and we always need STEM teachers. I didn't put it up here, but also special education teachers. We haven't been able to meet the needs of special ed teachers and special ed students for decades. Since the IDEA has come into play, we had not been able to meet that, okay? So we have to really think about scholarships, loans forgiveness, signing bonus, retention bonus, targeted specifically at these schools and these type of subject areas because they are the ones that are most in needs, okay? But that can address some short-term problem. We don't know whether or not, we really don't, how scholarships and grants and loan forgiveness and signing bonus would really affect teacher vacancy under the qualification for your district, okay? Because it could be already be saturated. You've already tried that, okay? So what we have to really think about is what is the long-term solution to our education system? Because this is not happening just recently. This is not happening just because of COVID. This has been going on for years, for decades, right? We have to absolutely increase the prestige and respect and the salary for teachers and the teaching profession. Some work by Matt Kraft has shown that the respect for teachers has dropped over the last 7-8 years, coinciding with the dramatic drop in teacher enrollment and production, okay? This is not something that's happening just now. This is going on for years, potentially decades. We need to really rethink about how the narrative around what it means to be a teacher in this country. Many of you mentioned that your grandparents or your parents were teachers themselves, right? So you have this like intergenerational families of teachers. That has changed. That has changed. Teachers are not, some teachers are telling their kids, don't become teachers. And some of you are smiling right now in the classroom because you know this, you've heard this. And you may have even said this to your own kids, okay, right? Because the pay isn't worth it in some places. The benefits don't outweigh the costs, right? And then what we see over the last couple of years in some places like Florida and Arizona, where the conversations around what it means to be a teacher has just worsened, right? About what teachers can or cannot say in the classroom, about what book they can use, whether they can talk about racism, whether they can talk about social emotional learning, right? It's kind of like in those states, why would anyone want to become a teacher when the pay isn't that great and you're liable to get sued and you're liable to, parents will knock on your door and potentially nobody's protecting you from doing what you want to do. To teach, to educate, and to work with kids. So really we have to think about how do we change the narrative of what it means to be a teacher in this country? Because it's not just any one single thing. It's not just about salary. It's also about the narrative, the prestige of what it means to be a teacher, right? It's about community. It's about the respect that needs to come with this profession. All right. So when I think about recruitment and retention, two of the ways that we can address some of this vacancy and underqualification issue, I think about what can we do to change what's going on now, okay? Like the long-term health of our education system, that's not something that we can do right now, right? That's gonna take time, years, decades to change that around. But what can we do right now, okay? So recruitment and retention, they're not two separate issues, as we've talked about yesterday and today. In some ways, they're two sides of the same coin. Districts that tend to do well with one tend to do well with the other as well. You have to think about this in tandem with each other, not separately, okay? And in many ways, it really do come down to a sense of belonging, connections, and resources. How do you leverage what you have or change where you are now in order to meet demand, in order to attract teachers to your schools and to your districts, okay? All right, so let's start with some recruitment strategies. Some of this is gonna be very straightforward and you're like, oh yeah, no kidding there, right? So things like offer higher pay, having a relocation bonus or subject-specific bonus for like STEM teachers. You can think about a $5,000 or $10,000 signing bonus, right? Or retention bonus. If you stay within the district for 2 or 3 years, then you get a substantial retention bonus. But it has to be substantial. We're not talking about like, if you finish teaching the rest of the year, you have $200. We're talking about $2, $3, $5, $10,000, okay? Because, if you increase salary by $1,000, are you going to actually see that in your pocketbook, right? Think about that, dividing that by 9 or 12 months, right? You're talking about like, $50, $60. It doesn't make you feel like there has been a change in your salary. It has to be substantial enough. And we've tested this out with small salary increases, and it just doesn't move the needle. It has to be substantial. Shift the timeline. We can't wait until July to put out ads about, oh, we have 2,000, 3,000 vacant positions. It's got to be, March, April, that we're like, hey, we already know, we project that we have these many numbers, right? We have to start advertising earlier. We talked about this before this next piece, including teachers of color in the hiring process. That's particularly important, okay? The teachers should represent the students that they teach, okay? And as part of that, you have to also think about how do we hire more principals of color? And there's some work recently suggesting we have to think one step beyond and think about superintendents, okay? Like the vast majority of teachers are women, right? And yet, 80% of superintendents are men, specifically white men. In fact, there are 9 names or something like that represent like 80% of superintendents in the United States, with some research coming out currently, just a few months ago, in education research. Like names like Kevin, that you're very likely to be a superintendent if you have that name. All right? So we have to think about this from a systematic and systemic perspective. Okay? And now some of you are going, I'm going to look up the name of my superintendents. You can see there's a whole paper on this and about the superintendents. But it's really a whole pipeline issue. It's from the top. From superintendents to principals to teachers. We have to think about how do we change this whole system. All right? And there's a lot of research showing that novice teachers are more likely to leave than more experienced teachers, okay? Except those who are near the retirement age. Some teachers of color are more likely to leave. Some STEM teachers are more likely to leave. And now think about the triple interaction of those. Think about a first or second year STEM teacher who's a person of color, okay? Most of those folks aren't going to be teaching next year or teaching in the same school. We have to think about providing supports and encouragement for those folks who we know from years of research and decades of experience, they need more attention. And yet some districts still don't provide that extra support and encouragement and support for those folks. All right. And this next piece is really more about for geographically sparse districts. Like in my home state, Kansas, the western part of Kansas is really sparsely populated. So everything is spread out, right? So you're thinking about pooling potentially district resources together for recruitment as well as professional development, because it's hard to provide PD for a math teacher, right, when you have literally like 2 math teachers in your entire district, right? So you're thinking about, hey, are there other districts nearby who also have, similar experiences and numbers? Can we pull together and pull out resources to provide PD for those folks? We've talked about partnering with teacher prep programs and GYOs, grow your own programs. That's becoming, that's a crow outside, right? That's like a huge one, and it's just like, it is, like it's very interesting. I apologize to the people online. But really, we have to start thinking, like, how do we grow our own supply in your district or in your state to meet the needs, okay? So this can't just be at the college level. We have to start thinking of like high school level, middle school level, thinking about how do we get them interested in the teaching profession, right? Being teacher assistants, provide them with some experience, and then let them know some of the benefits of being a teacher, right? Why you would want to become a teacher, why you stay as a teacher. That's important, all right? And of course, teacher scholarship and tuition reimbursement. All right, now in terms of advertisement strategies, I want to touch on that really quickly as well, because some of you may be interested in that. I'm thinking about ads for teacher positions. You want to highlight materialistic things in terms of salary and benefits if you can, but also non-materialistic incentives also matter. So for a lot of folks, they want to work in rural spaces because they grew up in rural spaces. They want to, be outdoors, right? They want to have that experience. Highlight that in your ads if that's what your community has, right? thinking about the assets of that your community has to offer, okay? And the crow is like right now walking around behind me, so. Just all parts of the fun, all right? You should highlight the positive aspects and assets of the job, but also be honest about the challenges in the ads, right? So thinking about, hey, if you are in a rural district, you might have to travel to get PD. You might have to teach multiple subjects, right? Because some rural teachers, they have to teach physics and biology and chemistry. They are the science teacher for their entire school or the entire district, right? So you have to be upfront about that, because what you don't want is for them to come to your school, experience like, I did not realize I'm responsible now for all of the science curriculum. I may stay for that year because I feel obligated. I sign up for this, but I'm going to leave the next year. That constant churn is really problematic for many districts. So you have to be upfront about the challenges that we have, all right? Ads that are geared towards to specific schools, like the high poverty schools, and majority minority school, to subject areas, be specific about that. And ads absolutely have to be visible on districts and school websites and sustained over time. It can't just be there, 1 or 2 weeks. It should be on there on a regular basis and updated so people can see this, all right? And the last piece here, and it's one that's really underused, that we should think about doing more, is using the employee's perspective, quotes, word of mouth. Many potential teacher candidates aren't finding jobs because of ad postings, okay? It's because they know somebody who's a teacher. It's because somebody, in a family or neighborhood is a teacher, and they go, I know there's a job opening. We should use that. We should encourage teachers to, say, hey, we have job opening. But also talk to teachers, like if they feel positive about working at your school, why not leverage that, right? Put that in as a part of the ads. They can see like, hey, somebody's like me, is working here, and they love working here. They love working in rural districts because they're able to, get to know the community, right? They really get to know their students, for instance. Use that. All right, and now I'm going to switch gear a little bit and talk about teacher attrition and turnover. Now, what are the things that we can do? And what I'm going to focus on is specifically school organizational characteristics. So things that are in many ways in the control of teachers and administrators at the school level, okay? So this is my work looking at approximately 140,000 teachers nationally over the course of 12 years, okay? So this is coming from the Schools and Staffing Survey, a nationally representative survey of teachers that are conducted every 3 to 4 years, starting in 1987, 1988. And it has gone on and continue. It has a new name now, but they do this every few years, all right? So when we look at this data over the course of 12 years of more than 140,000 teachers, what are some of the things that are consistently predictive of teacher attrition, all right? So I'm just going to focus on just panel A, and then we can go back and look at panel B and C later, but just panel A for right now. So these results are in a regression model that control for the teacher's characteristics. So this accounts for that they can be male or female, that their race and ethnicity, their certification, their salary, what kind of school they tend to work in, also other school characteristics. Okay, so we're accounting for all those things. So this is not just like, correlational data. We're trying to get more than that, okay? So accounting for a host of teachers and school characteristics, using more than about 140,000 teachers, what are some of the consistent findings? We see that if you increase administrative support, there is a consistent story in a decrease in teacher turnover, okay? And administrative support here actually really echoes really well of what the presentation that Doug did earlier and what the panel was talking about. So that can mean multiple things, right? It doesn't mean just any one thing. It could mean recognizing your teachers' positive stories, or the things that they do inside and outside the classroom, their accomplishment, for instance, right? So many teachers, they're accomplished artists or accomplished musicians. We should recognize that. It costs very, very little to recognize what your teachers do inside and outside of the classroom. Many teachers volunteer outside of the classroom. They have their own lives and their own interests. Highlight that. Show that to your students, to your school. In part, like, because you care, you should do that, right? But it makes them a part of the community. So whenever there is an increase in administrative support, we tend to see a decrease in teacher turnover. Teacher cooperation, that also comes up. When teachers are able to collaborate with each other, when they feel like they're a part of the community, of the school, they are less likely to leave. Principal effectiveness. When principals have more experience, when they are better at doing their job of connecting with teachers, providing instructional support, we also see a similar decline in teacher turnover. All right, and now if you want to break down to see specifically, does it matter if teachers are leaving your school to go to another school or to leave the profession altogether? There is a little bit of a more nuanced story here. So for instance, that we see that the more effective principals doesn't really prevent teachers from switching schools, okay? But it does prevent people from leaving the profession. So if you have a good principal, that helps prevent people from getting burnt out and leaving the profession, all right? In terms of teacher cooperation, if you have teachers collaborating with each other, that helps them stay in your current school. Like teachers who are collaborating with each other, who are sharing lesson plans, right? That helps them to want to stay in the school, in part why? Of that fit belonging story, right? They belong to that community. They know very likely if they move to another school, they may not get that same peer network, right? That support network that they may have in their current school. That prevents them from leaving their current school, right? It doesn't, though, seem to have a relationship with leaving the profession, meaning if they're burnout, if the teaching is not the right fit for them, it may not prevent them from leaving. This is average, right, overall, okay? It doesn't mean that it's necessarily true for any one particular teacher, but overall, this is what we tend to see, all right? So what other retention strategies can we think about in addition to these things that we can do at the school level, and which I think echoes really well with the conversations that we had yesterday, the presentation today, and as well as the panel, all right? What else can we do? So administrators and districts can think about really providing high quality, sustained mentoring and induction. And I have this slide in here prior to seeing Doug's presentation, all right? I did not modify this. I sent it, he can verify this. This was sent to him last night before I actually saw the presentation. So there it is, all right. And then another thing is thinking about gauging your staff's intentions. So if you can do a survey or even just talk to your teachers about what are your intentions for next year? Do you plan on coming back? Do you have some challenges I can help you with? Doing that in February and March, right, can be very helpful. You can see that people who are going to leave, sometimes they're going to be very loud about it. They know they're going to leave, right, by like April. But like in February and March, they're still like, hey, let's see how this goes. There are things you can still do to affect the decisions, okay? If their voices are heard, if they get to be a part of the decision-making process, that can help them to want to stay. So gauge your staff's intention. And then thinking about potential ways that you can address their concerns for next year. This was particularly meaningful for teachers during the first 2 years of COVID, right? Thinking about their safety. So many principals, really try to, provide wipes and to clean the windows and to clean the school so that teachers feel safe being in the classroom, okay? That helps a lot, right? It seems small, but it matters. And always thinking about providing additional support and encouragement for novice teachers, teachers of color, and STEM teachers, particularly if that you have intersections of those. And this last piece, it seems like it should be a given, but it's not, that teachers need to become a part of the conversations of actual decision-making power in the school, and not just like a part of like a committee that has no power. They have to have their voice. It actually has to matter. That helps them to become a part of the community, have some agency over what they want to do, right? All of that matters. In many ways, the findings that Doug and his group have really reflect the findings that are in the literature in terms of recruitment and retention. That piece about fit and belonging, connections, relationships matter, and then thinking about leveraging the assets or the resources that you have, okay? And I'm just gonna push that a little bit more and thinking about what else can we think about in addition to those pieces. When we are doing either recruitment or retention, we have to be deliberate about what it is we're doing. We have to make it targeted. Thinking about STEM teachers or special ed teachers, right? Target them specifically. Be supportive and encouraging. The working conditions for teachers matter so much, right? The conditions of the bathroom, of their own classroom, all those things matter. I think somebody, maybe it was Otis who mentioned the adequate materials, having just basic supply. So in the literature, we also have evidence of that. Teachers are much less likely to want to leave their classroom or the profession if they have adequate materials. And we're not talking fancy laptops. We're not talking about fancy copiers. We're talking about staplers. We're talking about, binders. Because they should not be spending $500 or $1,000 out of their own pocket to get materials because the school or the districts wouldn't provide them. Right? What does that say about the professions, about teachers, if they have to spend so much of their own money, of which there's little to begin with, to get stuff for their kids? And many of them still do, regardless of the fact that they don't have this. It's because they want to be there for their students, right? But we can't have that. Salary, of course, matters. We know this very, very well. And above all, and I think I have to really emphasize this, from the policymaker's perspective, from the administrative perspective, principal or superintendents, whatever it is that you're doing, it has to absolutely be sustainable from year to year. It cannot be a one-off. You can't change the culture of the school. You can't provide support for your teachers just for 1 year. It has to be sustainable, right? We have to think about how do we do this year after year after year? How do we do this even when we know that a superintendent might turn over the next year, because superintendents tend to turn over every 2 to 3 years, right? How do we keep this going when we know there's a good chance that the principal might leave? We have to think about this from a systematic and systemic perspective. It has to be sustainable in the long run. All right, thank you very much.
Okay, so we have some times for questions from the audience, and I think we have another mic. We'll go around the room, and we'll also get, if you're watching online, please feel free to post your question in the Q&A section of the Zoom, and we'll try to get to all the questions. Okay. Do you have a question?
I thought it was really interesting when you, towards the earlier part of your presentation, when you were talking about making targeted policy decisions, thinking about things for the long-term health of education. I think another aspect that needs to be discussed is physical protection of teachers. I think that we've all seen these videos on the internet where kids are coming up to teachers and attacking them. And I feel like it's almost like the pink elephant in the room that nobody's talking about. Teachers are expected to go into situations and in places where they could sometimes be in danger, and then there's no real consequences, or there may not be adequate consequences. And that might be another thing that's driving people away. So I'm supposed to go to work, not get paid enough, and then potentially get beat up by someone else's child. That would probably aid in the sharp decline. So I think that states needs to start thinking about ways that they can, better protect their teachers from things like that.
Yeah, I think that definitely goes to the teacher working conditions area, where it's not only just about their physical safety, but also their mental safety, right? Their mental well-being, right? So principals and superintendents have to, in a way, stand up for their teachers. They have to protect them, right? And social forces that could, interfere with the teaching process. In Texas, for instance, where, we see a lot of shooting. So it's now beyond just beating up teachers, right? And some teachers are afraid for their lives. And now, right, we have states that are saying, well, teachers should have guns in the classroom, and we need to have lockdown, and we have this and that. It's like, how does that change the tenure of the profession when we're talking about teachers have to carry guns? And it's like, if you can't provide teachers with staplers, how are you going to provide all teachers with, guns that are fingerprinted guns and a lock that only works for certain things or whatever? It's like, that's very unlikely, right? So there are many things that I think we have to think about. And it's possible that we can't address all of this in every single state, right? Because a lot of this it will come down to the politics in that state. What are the people in that state, in that district, are willing to do, right? Raising salary, that's something that you can do, right? We can vote to change that, right? But at the end of the day, it has to be a collective will of saying, we've had enough. We have to change this.
So I apologize for my question, but I think we always talk about administrative support, and if you ask administrators, they're like, we're supportive, and you ask teachers, and they say, no, they're not being supportive. So I was wondering if you could talk to us a little bit more about what is the research or what is something that you found, like for the teachers who are saying that administrative support is really helping us to stay, what does it look like?
I think that's a great question. So for many teachers, what that means is that the principals or the assistant principals are walking through the halls and then talking to teachers, observing their class, not for the purpose of evaluation, right? So it's like, I'm just interested in being in your classroom to see what are you doing with your students. I'm interested in getting to know you. I mean, we have that come up, right? That it's about knowing the people and connecting with them on a personal level, right? But also recognizing the good things that they do inside and outside of class. Many schools do not have, announcements that are about like what teachers have done, like the positive things that they've done for their schools and their communities. We should recognize that, because that's not only relevant to them as people, but it's relevant to the community. They are a part of the community. They need to hear that, right? And I know there's also research showing that principals, and I'm not saying this is easy to do by any means, that principals are also stressed and burnout. That's in part why they leave so much. In the last 10, 15 years, what is expected of principals, that's only increased, right? So, now there's dealing with thinking about Twitter and phones and Instagrams and some of them have to do fundraisings, right? So in addition to being an instructional coach, in addition to being, getting to know your teachers, they have now to juggle so many balls in the air, right? So by no means is research saying, if only your administrators do this one simple thing, it'll be fixed. Right? But what we're building is we're building up this evidence base of there are things that each level can do in order to contribute to this overall picture. But it's not any one single thing, as the research that Doug and his group has found out, right? It's a combination of these in many ways, because it's building that community, that organization, right? That where teachers feel like they belong. So I don't have any like specific thing that they should do, but that general nature of things. Yeah.
Good morning. Marilyn Davis. I'm with the Center of Pedagogy here on campus. In the past, I've worked with the federal government in recruitment in the healthcare professions using the workforce development, which used to be called the unemployment office, websites where they track the number of openings and they provide immediate access to applications and preparation. I was wondering if you are aware of anything similar in the workforce development system for teachers. So do we know how many, do they track how many teacher vacancies there are and ways for us to access that as individuals to apply for positions?
I would absolutely love it if the federal government did that, but they do not. We absolutely need to get on that. So I am working with many colleagues across the country to do it at a state by state level, right? So we're getting information from Kansas, we're getting information from North Carolina, but as far as the federal government is concerned, that's not something that they're doing yet. But they're recognizing that they need to do it. So in this latest round of the Academic Council advisement, they put a report, and the issue of teacher shortage is one of them. And they very much recognize that this is data that we need to think about this teacher vacancy and the qualification shortage problem, right, for the entire country and for the vast majority of our states. And we need data to inform our decisions.
So just a question in terms of just the idea of vacancies as opposed to being underqualified, right? It would seem for me, even looking at the map and looking at the data from each state, that each state has its kind of own context, even in terms of what counts as a qualified instructor, right? Or what is the certification process, or how many students do you have in general, right? Like I would assume Wyoming is very different from Illinois, just in terms of just having cities, big metropolitan areas, right? So what would be the difference between addressing, I guess in your opinion, addressing a vacancy issue as opposed to addressing like an underqualified issue?
Okay, that's a great question. So addressing a vacancy issue, I think that has to do a lot more with the teacher supply side and teacher retention, right? So thinking about, hey, we don't have enough people who are interested in joining the profession, right? And too many teachers are leaving. We can't fulfill the needs that we have. The underqualification piece can have those pieces attached too, but it's sometimes about, are we producing too many of one type of teachers, right? In some states, they actually overproduce elementary ed teachers, like in Tennessee, right? In Kansas, my home state, we actually desperately need elementary ed teachers, right? There are two general buckets of teachers that are needed in almost every state, and that's STEM teachers and special ed teachers. Almost every state, we're not producing enough of that, okay? Now, you can say, well, Texas seems like they're producing a lot of teachers, and they may have actually more STEM or special ed teachers who are needed. But that's only on paper that they're producing those folks. We don't know how many of those folks are actually joining, right? So policy that address the vacancy issue, it can be different than the underqualification, right? Because if it's just a matter of, do we just have too many people who want to work in this urban district as opposed to this rural district, then we can think about incentives of moving them from one to the other, right? To have ads or sign-on bonus or something like that to move them. But if you don't have enough people in the first place to address the vacancy issue, then it's going to be hard to address the underqualification issue. And then in some states, you see that, hey, you may not, like in New Jersey, you may not have that many vacant positions here, but that's because you have enough people, you have enough teachers, right, that you can hire to teach, but they may be teaching out of subject area, right? That's all I have for that. I'm not sure if that answers your questions or not.
We have time for one more question if there's, I'm looking online. I don't think we have one yet. Oh, she beat me. I'm giving it to the.
Thank you so much for your presentation. Sumi Hagiwara with the College of Education and Human Services. Curious to know your thoughts about the growing interest in creating programs in teacher ed that are flexible and really attentive to students' interests and needs. And so, for instance, and specifically, online teacher preparation or hybrid teacher preparation, and might that be one way in which we as a teacher ed community could be responsive and the challenges to that as well?
Absolutely. So I think most states are trying this out of creating online hybrid MAT programs or residency programs to see if that's going to meet the needs of the state. The challenge here is that, as far as I know, we don't have very robust evidence as to that's changing, right? And once they finish the program, how many of them actually join the teaching workforce in the first place? And then you have the questions of how effective are those folks, right? Because you're going to have these for-profit programs who are just, it's a paper mill. I mean, let's be honest, and that's what it is, all right? They're just like, hey, you give us $5,000, $6,000, and you're now certified to teach. But most of them don't join the teaching workforce, and when they do, I think they tend to leave at a fairly high rate, right? And so that can address like short term, like, oh, next year, I guess we have to do that to meet those needs. But then it creates a cycle of churn at the school level or at the district level, right? And depending on whether or not you're a rural or urban school, it can cost as much as $10,000, $20,000 to replace a single teacher every year. Multiply that by the number of teachers that are leaving every year, right? So we are trying some of those grow your own program, residency program, and online MAT programs, but it's going to take us 2, 3, 4 years to really figure out how effective are those in addressing the supply needs, and then more years than that to figure out how effective are those teachers in the first place. So I think it's going to be really, really tricky to figure out, and that's part of the challenge of doing research on this, is that we want to know the answers to those now, right? But because if we're looking at teacher effectiveness, we need 2, 3, 4, 5 years of data to actually figure that out. We don't know them until, much later, right? But that's in part why so many of us are trying to work with state departments to get the most current data as we can so that we can answer them as quickly as we can and not rely on, let's say this national survey that I use here that comes out every 3 to 4 years, right? Because then by the time that we get it and we analyze it, it's a little bit too late now to think about how do we address those.
I'd like you to join me in thanking Dr. Nguyen. Thank you so much. For those of you online, please stay tuned. You're going to see the keynote that was offered yesterday by Julia Hazel from Portland Public Schools in Maine. For the rest of us in the room here, lunch is served. For those of you who are heading out, there's some takeout containers. Feel free to grab a sandwich on your way out. But I do hope that many of you stick around for our last little session at 1, from 1 to 1:30, where we sort of wrap up our whole conference and figure out I'm going to ask you, what are you taking back with you? So if you want to think about that during lunch. What are you taking back with you besides sandwiches or large birds? What are you taking back with you from the conference? So thank you, everybody, and thank you, Dr. Nguyen.
My pleasure.